After the fall of the Brolly Corporation, reports started popping up all over the world of bots trying to sell their services in the podcast black market. My investigation took me to places all over the world where little did I know I would encounter an old friend who knew all too well about the threat that they posed.
I'm back.
Adam, I thought you went missing after Terminator Month.
Well, technically everything was hunky-dory until I heard about a little Kickstarter campaign from the Brolly Corporation. You know, one thing led to another, and after some digging, I found out their nefarious secret. Organic promotions, thousands of fake views, Red Panda City was only the beginning. Just look at this.
Triangle Brolly Corporation, legally distinct from the other one, Pinky Promise, Do Not Steal. Damn them! So what do we do now? Delve through another adventure rich with puzzles, horror and intrigue? Or maybe we can... Did you just punch that boulder?
Pretty sick, right? Who needs guns when you've got these guns?
Good lord, you could bench press a sandwich shop with those... Anyway, that's beside the point. We've got to nip this issue in the bud as soon as possible.
I'm way ahead of you. But before we begin, there's a few ground rules I've got to lay out. First, we're going with double. No, triple the explosions. We're gonna make the Spencer Mansion incident look like a firework in a hurricane. 2 more bombastic locations. The Pandalorians need to be kept confused long enough not to question plot holes.
And the final thing?
I want you to call me by my code name, Adam Bredfield.
Nope, absolutely not. No way.
Albert Whisker? Civ? What about Pies Nivens? Oh, Ingrid Bunnigan?
This is going to be a long mission, isn't it?
Oh, yes it is. Welcome to Resident Evil Month.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Resident Evil Month. My name is Satsunami and joining me today is none other than, well, unfortunately I have to call him by his contractually obligated name, as none other than Adam Bredfield. Adam, welcome back.
Oh, it is wonderful to be back and I feel all fresh just with this new name and everything. Oh, it just feels right, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've got to ask because, you know, the sandwich is looking a lot more muscly recently. Talk us through your workout regime.
Well, basically, given that I am a sandwich, obviously, and this is sorry to go peel behind the scenes here, but obviously, once recording's done, Satsu has to stick me up in the freezer. I am a sandwich. My shelf life is limited, you know, so he's going to stuff me deep in that freezer. But, you know, being in the freezer gives you plenty of time to focus, work on your core, work on your biceps. I can lift all those frozen pizzas that you keep in there, all those chicken breasts, whatever else you got in your freezer.
For anyone coming into this episode for the first time, as a first-time listener, please, for the love of God, look at his avatar. It's a sandwich.
Better, I think, when you have no clue what's going on.
Yeah, you're right. Just ignore what I said. No context. He's just a talking sandwich. I'm a red panda. Let's get into Resident Evil Month, of course. But yeah, Adam, before we begin, most importantly, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right, thanks. It's nice to be back on. I can't imagine. I do wonder how many people, if you asked to talk about these two games, how many people would just slam the phone down in anger, you know, and never talk to you again. But luckily, I'm one of the few people who's actually quite excited to come and talk about these two games. So you know your friends and your supporting cast well, I'll say that.
Yes, you are indeed my rock that's not going to be punched into a lava pit of this podcast, because this is a PodPack collaboration month, of course. We have got some amazing podcasters, creators and people on here. This month we have got Luke from the Howdy Beans podcast. We have got Joey from the Game Club podcast. We of course have yourself, Adam, fantastic co-host and friend. I should have said friend first because that's more important.
I feel like my name is starting to stick out here as the sore thumb. So it's like I got all these amazing people and then I just fished Adam out of the freezer.
And guest starring Adam. Woo! And last but certainly not least, next week we will indeed have the amazing Dan from Casting Views talking about Resident Evil 7 and 8, which is going to be terrifying but also fantastic. But this week, of course, we are diving into, some of the more contentious games of the series. And going back to something you said there about the picking and choosing of this month, I went to the PodPack and I said, right guys, who wants to be involved in this month? Who wants to take what what game. Luke immediately said, I want to talk about the 2 and 3 remake. Joey wanted to talk about the 4 remake. Dan, for some reason, wanted to take 7 and 8, and then while he was playing them, he started shouting at me saying, why did you make me play these games? These are terrifying. I apologise because I was also screaming. But then there was a sandwich-shaped hole, as it were. And I was like, who am I going to get to play these games? And then I was telling you about the month and everything, and then you graciously accepted my bombardment of please messages, e-begging, that kind of thing. So yes, thank you so much, because today we are indeed going to be talking about Resident Evil 5 and 6, which, Adam, is it right to say these are the black zombie sheep of the franchise?
Well, I think definitely for the most part. I think that would be most people's impression, certainly of 6. 5 certainly as well, but I think 5 enjoys a slightly more positive consensus around it, although people still don't like 5. But certainly I think if you were to take both these games, this is probably seen as a bit of the nadir, honestly, of the Resident Evil month, I would say, in the popular opinion anyway.
Whenever you think of the silliness of the franchise, I mean, obviously you think of the films, and of course the other day I finally watched Welcome to Raccoon City. Have you ever seen that, by the way, before we get into this?
I have not, I'll be honest.
It's free on Prime. Anyway, long story short, I feel as if there's only one scene that's absolutely hilarious, and then the rest of it can just be binned. It is very baffling how much they have fumbled around the Resident Evil series outside of the games. I mean, you've got your bad games, of course, as well, but I would probably limit that to the spin-off games where they tried something different, and you think, well, they're not trying to capitalise on the core series, the numbered games, and also the Netflix series, but we don't talk about the Netflix series. But yeah, for these ones, I remember when especially the 5th game came out, and I don't know about you, but I remember seeing this, and I think it was HMV. This is how long ago it was. It was an HMV, and they had clips from 5 all over the gaming section, and for some reason it was, the intro that they play in the game, and it's quite violent, I have to say. The guy who gets the parasite shoved down his throat and everything, and he's squirming, and then he bursts and turns into a big gribbly monster. It's quite violent to show to the public, I'm not gonna lie. But for the 6th one, I would say that I found out about its reputation before I actually looked into it. I had no interest in playing Resident Evil 6 before that. I think a mutual friend had told me that they tried playing it, they got stuck in a car, and it's like they had to do a quick time event, but you could just leave it and you didn't really have to do anything. The game just waited until you pressed the button. So it was infamous from day one, and we will get into that because the gaming landscape of 2012 when 6 came out was absolutely brutal for that kind of thing. But switching it back onto you, what was your first exposure, see, to 5 and 6?
Well, Resident Evil 5 is the first Resident Evil game I ever played. This is actually kind of what got me into the series. So I remember when this game was coming out, so obviously it came out in 2009, so I must have started seeing promotional stuff for it, either the back end of 2008 or kind of early 2009. And this was a time when, so I was in my late teens at this point, kind of getting towards the end of high school. I was getting much more into I say much more into video, I was always into video games. I was getting maybe a wider perspective on video games, like I was maybe more interested to try genres that I hadn't before. Obviously I was of that age where perhaps I was looking for slightly more mature experiences, in gaming and everything than maybe what I'd played previously. Obviously I really enjoyed shooters, even at that time I enjoyed. So I remember seeing the promotional stuff for it, and I remember I was quite into watching a lot of the E3 stuff from that year. Whatever the E3, whether it was 2009, 2008, I can't remember, whatever the one before the game was released. I was really into watching that, and I remember watching the demo for 5 and hearing a lot about it and being really interested in it. I liked the setting and everything. I thought it looked really cool. So when it came out, I'm pretty sure, I didn't buy it, but I'm pretty sure I rented it. I'm showing my age there as well, but I remember renting it and playing a lot through, really enjoying it at the time, and then that kind of didn't instantly kickstart me into sort of playing all the other games, but I have subsequently played every other mainline Resident Evil game, after that, so it definitely was my entry point. With regards to 6, I didn't play 6 till a good few years after it came out, probably like 4 or 5 years, to be honest. As with you, I also knew the game by its reputation before I played it, so I didn't go in with maybe particularly high hopes, so I do think that clouded my view of the game before going in. So I didn't really go in with an unbiased opinion because I kind of knew what the consensus was on it. So a little bit similar to you, but I was very much into 5 at the time and was very excited to play it when it came out.
I had a friend, I remember, who played it, and that that way when you go over to a friend's house when you're in school and they're playing a game and you're like, oh, what's this game? And they're like, oh, it's the game X, game Y. But in this case, of course, it was Resident Evil 5. And I think they must have been playing the Mercenaries mode. Because, and again, I could be totally wrong, but I'm convinced they were playing as Albert Wesker. So I'm assuming that's the mercenary mode or something like that. They had the really stupid pistol. Do you remember this as like the really long pistol?
I don't remember the long pistol. I mean, that does sound like Mercenaries mode, to be honest with you, which was... Oh, good. Did Mercenaries mode start in... I don't even know if it started in 5 Mercenaries mode or it started before that, but certainly I know it was becoming a bigger thing, I'm pretty sure. Certainly by 6 it was. I'm pretty sure as well it was in 5, but yeah. Sounds like it.
I would say, in terms of the gameplay, that was my first exposure to it. And it's one of these games that, again, you see it in passing, you realise how popular it is. But again, I had no real interest at the time in horror games or anything like that. So I was like, oh, that looks like a cool game. Moving on back to Sonic. Although, sorry, technically back then I would have been into Call of Duty and Halo and, gritty manly games, as I said. Because Resident Evil 5 came out in 2009, didn't it?
Yep, it did. I think that kind of traditional... When the games traditionally get released, October, isn't it? It's tough time, September, October. I'm pretty sure it was around then.
Yeah, so at least for me personally, I think I was getting towards the end of high school and everything, and I don't know, I was just a scaredy cat. I didn't want to play a game with zombies, that it sounds weird to say because at the same time, there was a lot of similar games that came out, like Left 4 Dead 2 especially, and some particular games that we will talk about later on. But it seemed as if it was quite similar to a lot of games that were coming out at the time, and I was more interested in co-op games and, more action shooter games than this particular one, which I know is ironic because this is literally the one where someone punches a boulder into a thing of lava. So yeah, it was interesting. But before we dive into this, because I think we both have a lot to say about both of these games, I reached out to our amazing Pandalorians and asked them what they thought about this game. So Adam, are you ready to hear some of the tales that you're about to hear from the lovely listeners at home?
Lay them on me.
So I asked friend of the channel and fellow PodPack member Dan from Casting Views about it. He said, oh man, it was so long ago, but wasn't 5 where you had the companion whose AI was frustrating as hell? To which I of course responded, that's the one. And then he said, oh, and 6 has an inappropriate cover. We will get onto the inappropriate cover, don't you worry. Yes, the infamous giraffe, isn't it?
That's it. That's the one.
Yes, we will touch on it. I shouldn't say touch on it, sorry.
You can touch on it if you want. I'll stand back.
I do not want that pervert on this channel. Yeah, the next comment comes from High Score High Stakes Podcast, who says, RE5 is an excellent game. It refined the RE4 formula and gave it co-op, whilst the horror elements took a massive hit. It was really fun to play. RE6 can get in the bin though. Too long, boring, and it had nothing memorable at all. Designed by committee at its worst. Fellow PodPack member Seismic Cinema said, played RE5 with my brother. Wasn't a big fan, to be honest. Hadn't played any other game before, but it seemed like an action game with none of the horror associated with Resident Evil. I gave up when Chris had to fist the boulder to progress. Always bothered me how you were chasing bad people through these elaborate puzzles and levels, trying to catch up, but they were always at the other end. Like, how did they get there? And last but not least, friend of the channel said, he sent me a gif of a shirtless Wesker and just said, give me 7 minutes with this man. That's it. That's the thoughts. I feel like, and again, I don't want to court any Wesker aficionados, let's just say, but I feel like there's a lot of people that probably feel that way about certain characters. Yeah, have you got any thoughts on that before we begin?
No, it's interesting to hear other people's thoughts on it. Some thoughts that I think I definitely share there. Whether that's Wesker related or not, I shall not say. But yeah, definitely some thoughts I share there. And it's interesting to hear some other ones that perhaps I maybe don't as much agree with, but still interesting to hear.
Without any further ado, will we dive into it?
Let's do it.
And of course, we will be right back after these messages. Welcome to Satsunami, a Scottish variety podcast that discusses topics from gaming and films to anime and general interests. Join me, your host, Satsunami, as well as the rest of our Satsunami team for our takes on these very important pop culture topics.
Sir, it's clearly a trap. I accept your bait! That happens 3 times in the film. Like, every time that general goes, don't do this one thing, he goes, do you know what I'm going to do? That's the exact
It does as well. She had the pointy teeth. What was that about?
She looked like Bilbo when he wants the ring back.
She did, didn't she? I just want the lightsaber one more time.
Parasite says, "No, you will get back into your office and work."
No, says the man in Zoom.
Yeah.
Trousers are for the working man.
You're bursting into your hotel room. Honey, we need to go.
Leave the kids. You can milk an audition.
Oh! That's the worst thing you've ever said in any of the episodes.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can check us out at our website, chatsunami.com, as well as all good podcast apps. As always, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, stay hydrated.
Stay classy and have a banana. This has been Satsunami.
I'm sorry.
Greetings! My name is Robotic Battle Toaster. I'm a variety game streamer on Twitch. There, I play a range of both multiplayer and single-player games. You can also find me on Twitter and in my Discord server, where you can vote what games I play. And, of course, join in on the fun and back-and-forth banter in a relaxed and safe environment. I hope to see you there. So, without any further ado, let's get back to Satsunami. Ta-ta!
Seriously though, I cannot believe that he could do that kind of thing in 7 minutes. You know, usually it takes... Oh, sorry, we're back. So, Adam. Sorry, is that joke okay?
Yeah, no, go for it.
So, Adam, will we dive into the weird and wonderful world of Resident Evil 5 first of all?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's hold hands and skip into the heart of Africa.
This game is such an anomaly to me, to be honest, because as I've said in past episodes this month, my first game of the series that I played all the way through, although I've technically seen Let's Plays and things like that, the first game that I played of this series was the Resident Evil 4 remake. Absolutely loved it, and that was the game that genuinely inspired me to go back, play the first one, play 2 and 3, play 5 and 6 of course, and then 7 and 8, which trust me we will get onto next week. I have to say the history of this game is absolutely fascinating. The way I described it to you and last week as well was the way that Resident Evil 4 seemed to change the whole formula of the franchise. So it went from survival horror and all these elaborate puzzles to slightly more action-oriented. And the way I thought of it was, relating back, ironically enough, to our Terminator month, was that Resident Evil 4 seems to be the kind of turning point. It is the Terminator 2 of this franchise, isn't it?
I think that's a fair comparison.
And what I mean by that, sorry, before I hand it back to you there, is that when I say the Terminator 2, it's something that I brought up when we were discussing all the films on Terminator month, which honestly feels like yesterday, but I know it was years ago, and I can't believe that. But when we were rewatching the Terminator films, it felt as if 1 and 2 were absolute peak. They were at the height of their game. And then after that, Terminator 2 was so good and so perfect in the way that it did the formula that all of the preceding films wanted to copy it, and they never quite reached that same height. And that's how I feel especially about 5, where, and well, technically, that's how I feel about 5 and 6. I feel as if they were trying to hit the heights of the action set pieces, the goofiness, but try and weave in some horror and such, and they just never hit the same heights as 4. And I'm not saying that makes them bad games necessarily, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Adam?
I think just to extend the Terminator 2 comparison a little bit more, I think as well, like Terminator 2, Resident Evil 4 was also widely critically praised, and also we did very well financially. So from a pure sort of economic viewpoint, it made complete sense for Capcom to try and build on that. You know, that was a formula they'd proven to be very successful, you know, was something that was going to lead to good revenue and also like wide-scale praise for them. So I completely understand why they went that direction. Now, again, whether you think the way they evolved on that was good or bad, I think is a bit of personal preference there. But no, I can see your point. 5 definitely took a lot of the elements from 4 and ran with them. It certainly carried on a lot of things. Obviously, the control scheme in a way is quite reminiscent of 4. Obviously, it was updated for the more modern consoles of the time. But, you know, it's still that over-the-shoulder shooting. When you're shooting, you can't move. You know, so definitely built on that kind of idea. Obviously, lent more into the action, which 4 had already started. But yeah, as well, it was trying to do its own, obviously trying to do its own things as well. The biggest thing being co-op. That was a really big departure. Well, it was a big departure, I think, for the mainline series. So, and then also as well, kind of finding its own middle ground by, as you say, again, maybe putting more of the action in, more kind of set piece set-piece action sequences, and I guess the horror being, I don't know if they deliberately de-emphasized the horror as a purpose thing. I think it maybe was just probably a symptom, I think, a little bit of the kind of direction they went. But I think it very much, for me, it's very much a kind of evolution. As the storyline has the evolution of the last Plagas virus, I think Resident Evil 5 is a kind of evolution of the core ideas and the core mechanics and gameplay and systems of 4.
Yeah, because from what I've seen of it, it seemed to really refine a lot of the mechanics in 4, but ironically enough, it also backtracked in a lot of them, so there was no longer a merchant character that you could go to. You had to do all your inventory reorganising in between missions, which you and I got very accustomed to, didn't we, when we played through this game. It felt weird for me personally, and I've been called out by Martin McAllister for this, by the way, so bear with me. But the way I played these games in order was played the 4 remake first, then I played the 2 and 3 remake, then 7 and 8 because I was waiting until we had time together to play the 5th game, and then once I played through all of them, I went back to the first game and I also played the 6th game. In the first game, I could kind of give it a bit of leeway because it was remade in 2002 and everything. I could understand the fixed camera angles and having to stand and shoot. For this one, this genuinely took me off guard completely because I completely forgot that you couldn't move and shoot at the same time. Initially, it was really hard to get used to because remember when we were playing it and you're like, oh, what fun. And I was like, how do you shoot? How do you aim? I'm not saying there's a hidden recording on Patreon of that or anything, but it was a challenge, wasn't it?
It certainly is. I think as well, it's probably important to, obviously I know you've done Resident Evil 4 already, so not to go on a massive tangent on that, but I think it is important to distinguish between the original Resident Evil 4 and the remake of Resident Evil 4. Obviously, they share a lot of similar DNA and everything, but the remake does have a more modern style of gameplay, and everything to the original. And so, in a way, playing Resident Evil 4 remake and then playing this, well, I know you didn't do that, but presuming you did, 5 probably doesn't seem as much a natural progression. It probably maybe in some ways seems a bit of a regression, but if you're playing the original Resident Evil 4, back in the day, then playing this very much did feel like a kind of, I say an evolution. Again, it depends on what because people would argue it maybe was a regression anyway, but it certainly felt it was trying to build off of that original game more than certainly it does feel now that the remake is, probably the more popular version of Resident Evil 4, certainly currently anyway.
Yeah, because something that I want to point out is that I'm not criticising this game for the gameplay, because it came out in 2009. There's not been a remake yet as of recording this episode, and I swear to God, when this episode comes out, if there's been an announcement, I'll have to edit a thing in and be like, hey, Satsunami here. Yeah, that's more a kind of hindsight thing, going back to old mechanics and things, and that doesn't necessarily make it bad, but the cracks do show in certain regards when you've got a trained soldier and he's just kind of standing there like a lemon, just shooting, and it's like, move, Chris, move, move, Siobhan. You can't, because, he's bolted to the ground. But something that I brought up to you just before we started this is the fact that it's quite interesting the type of games that were coming out around this time, and I've just got a few examples here because, as I said, 2009, fine year, etc., but we had quite gritty games, didn't we? I say gritty, some of them are fantastical, but we had Assassin's Creed 2, we had Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Left 4 Dead 2, there was a lot of 2s going around, Uncharted 2 even, Infamous, Demon's Souls, Bayonetta, which I did not realise, Prototype, those kind of quite gritty looking games, but also very action oriented. Oh, also, your favourite Halo game, Halo 3 ODST, came out this year.
Woohoo! I'm glad you managed to name drop that in here. A complete unrelated thing. You're like, better mention ODST.
Oh, you love it.
You're a smooth operator, Mr. Satsu.
Oh, anyway, before you eject me in the studio for that. Yeah, it was quite a more, obviously not for all games, but the gaming landscape at that time seemed to be going in a more gritty direction, didn't it? And you can certainly tell it with this game that it was, as we're saying, it was less focused on the horror, although there was horror elements, but it's kind of hard to see it as a horror game when you're playing as Chris Beefy Boy Redfield, world as opposed to realistic proportions versus a JoJo character punching zombies and everything.
I think as well, I think it's a good point to raise about the kind of tone around AAA games of this time, certainly. I think as well, the other thing to point out is to point out the other trends going on at that time, and particularly I'm going to draw it back to two games you mentioned, which were Modern Warfare 2 and Uncharted 2. Obviously, this was the heyday of the modern military shooter. It was at its height. It was its peak of popularity. We're not that far removed at this point from seminal title Call of Duty 4. And alongside that, we're also seeing the rise of the action-adventure. And basically, this is the period, to me anyway, that AAA games basically became action-adventure games. That was the kind of staple. That's what people expected games to be. Uncharted 2 being the prime example and probably the one that really did help to maybe not quite kickstart it off, but certainly cement this trend. They were the two, I think, probably most popular games of this year. I remember the two of them being in contention for Game of the Years. I think they were two of the best-selling games of the year. So really, that's where the trends were going. Being a video game company that wants to make money, I think you can maybe see why Capcom were looking at what was happening around the industry, seeing where the trends were, and maybe looking at potentially how they could start to align their series towards this. Now, I don't think Resident Evil 5 is a full move into it. Certainly not a full move into action-adventure. It perhaps is more of a step towards a modern military shooter, probably. But it certainly was steps in that direction, which, would continue with 6. But yeah, I think that kind of context is important because it was what was popular at the time. It's what people wanted to play.
As you know, when a company gets a game that is received so positively in terms of gameplay, story, that kind of thing, and you know where I'm going with this, the fact that all of the players loved 4, so they took all of these tropes and things of the time and they decided to carry it forward. And it's so fascinating because before this you had 1 to 3, which were complete survival horrors on the PlayStation and 64, that kind of thing. And then, of course, you had Code Veronica in between, which I have to give a shout out to that one, and a couple of spin-offs. But when 4 came around, and again, just mirroring what you're saying, I won't spend too much time on that, but 4 definitely changed the direction of the series. So I think when they saw the dollar or the yen signs in their eyes, they were like, yeah, okay, this is where Resident Evil needs to go. I can't exactly begrudge them for making that decision, and especially as a new fan of the series as opposed to an old school one, but I can't really begrudge them because obviously for a series to survive, you have to go with the trends, otherwise you're only going to get that hardcore fan base, and I'm going to be honest, unless they're buying thousands of copies a day, don't think they're going to make their money back from that. But yeah, it is fascinating to see that this is the direction they decided to go with this. And yeah, the story as well, because I think this is a good time to talk about A, the story, and B, the Ouroboros elephant in the room, if that's okay to address it.
Of course, let's go for it.
As I was facetiously saying, the Ouroboros elephant in the room, which is of course the reception that this game had well before it came out. So as we were talking about, the whole story revolves, and spoilers ahead, but the story revolves around Chris Redfield from, of course, the first game, getting sent to Africa with the BSAA, who are a counter-bioterrorism task force. Is that right in saying?
Yeah, it's a kind of, I guess a slight war on terror analogy.
And he gets sent in with the West African BSAA department, or their contingency, as it were, and they are investigating an outbreak of the, well, I would say Las Plagas, but it's just the Plagas outbreak from the 4th game, which seems to be erupting in this village in Africa. So he gets there, he ends up teaming up with Sheva, who is, again, another member of the BSAA there, and the two of them vow to try and stop this outbreak from happening. And along the way, Chris is, of course, trying to find one of his long-lost companions, which we will get onto later, and then he comes across an old foe by the name of Albert Wesker, which, again, we'll get onto him as well. It ends the way you would think a Resident Evil game ends, with just a massive explosion and sunglasses getting thrown in the air. But before we go on to talk about those particular points, before this game came out, and I'm actually curious if you heard about this before you played this game, but there was an editor from, I think it was Newsweek it was called, that pointed out that there was a lot of racist imagery that seemed to be coming out this game. Of course, Chris Redfield going into Africa and showing some uncomfortable imagery, but on the flip side, I think there was a lot of people who countered this, and said that no, it wasn't racism, and they had a diverse group of characters that were in the game and things. Of course, Eurogamer also picked up on the controversy controversy, and I think kind of added fuel to the fire with it. But did you hear about this at the time?
I actually surprisingly did not. Now, I'm going to probably partly put this down to as much as I was becoming more interested in video games. I wasn't maybe looking at the widest range of different sources, to be honest. I think as well, as you point out, a lot of this obviously came quite early on, sort of 2007, it looks like, the kind of 2007 E3 trailer. I think as well, it might be worth pointing out that at this point, I don't know if they decided to make this a co-op game, because a lot of that footage, I think, very much focused around just Chris fighting off waves of enemies. Now, of course, you can certainly understand, I can totally see where the controversy came from, and to be honest, I can completely understand why people have an issue with this game, with some of its imagery, with its setting and the like. You know, it's obviously, as you mentioned, it's not by any means, it doesn't seem to be a uniform opinion on it. It does seem quite divided. One thing as well, just for a matter of interest, because I didn't actually know this until recently, but the BBFC, so that's in Britain, that's the British Board of Film Classification, kind of looked into one cutscene from the game that was quite notorious, where a white woman is sort of being dragged away by one of the kind of enemy characters. And they looked into that, because that was often held up as a scene that was highlighting the kind of racism of this game. They looked into it. In their opinion, they didn't consider it to be racist for what that's worth. Again, I don't think that should be a definitive categorization to say this game isn't racist, because if that's what you feel, I completely understand. And I think there's enough sort of evidence there to back that up if that's the way you feel. While similarly, if you don't feel that way, I think as well, I can understand that as well. But it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one, and I can completely see where it came from. It looks like this surprised Capcom quite a lot. I don't think Capcom quite expected this. So I think it was something that they kind of, I think, had to scramble a bit to deal with. To be honest, I don't know where I fall on this, to be 100% honest. There's some parts of me that are like, is this any worse a depiction of Africa than Resident Evil 4 is a bad depiction of Spain? Or, you know, the early Resident Evil games are a bad depiction of the USA. On that level, part of me is like, I don't know if it's any worse. On the other hand, though, I do think there are some problematic parts in it. There's a bit where you go to a village, a tribal village, which I think is quite problematic in some of the way the enemies are portrayed and the like. So again, part of me is like, I just don't quite know where I fall in it, to be honest, because I can completely see both sides. I don't know what your kind of thoughts on it are.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that point, because on the one hand, I can understand why people were making those particular comparisons, let's just say, because, yeah, when you look at that imagery of Chris going into Africa and everything, and you can definitely see that I think Capcom probably just didn't really, as you were saying, I think Capcom didn't really expect it, because this isn't really the first time they've been semi-insensitive. I remember when I tried out Resident Evil 4 for the first time, the original one, and I've got a friend in Spain, and I messaged them and I was like, oh, look, I'm playing this game, they are talking Spanish, and then they got back to me and said, technically they're not, and it's like, what do you mean? It's like, well, they are speaking Spanish, but they're speaking Latin American Spanish, which I know you might think, oh, well, what's the difference kind of thing, but again, it's Capcom going, Latin American Spanish, you know, same thing. And again, I don't think that was a purposely racist thing, but I do think on the other hand, it's just more in the lines of insensitivity. And I think as well, this is probably where this lands for me, that I don't think it was intended to be racist, probably, and I can't say that 100%. You know, I'm not going to say that if you feel as if this game's racist or anything, or the depictions are uncomfortable, you know, I'm not going to say, oh, you're wrong, because you're obviously entitled and valid to feel that way, listener. But I just think it seems more of they've kind of thought, oh, here's an idea, and then they've put it in, and you're like, oh, that is very uncomfortable, because again, I was in the same mindset as you. At the very beginning, you've got all of the infected villagers and they're coming at you. I genuinely don't think that was intended as being racist, and I think that it is very valid to say that it's no worse to be angry at the fifth game for killing people who are from that country, and then not being angry at killing people from their country in the fourth game, because as well then that leads into the issue of, well, if you're not going to have native African people in this game, then you're going to cause more issues, if that makes sense. You know, you're just going to erase them from the game. It's like that doesn't fix the issue either, so it's literally a boulder in a hard place with this. But the one that I do agree with you was when Adam and I were playing through this game, and you said to me there's one particular scene that is quite uncomfortable in a way, and I was like, what do you mean? Surely it can't be any worse than what we've been playing, you know, it must just be the same. And then when we go to that level where they're all dressed in the tribal gear and things, and yeah, I'm not going to lie, I'm totally with you on that boat. I thought that was a little bit too far, and they tried to wave it off in the game that, oh, this is the outfit of that particular tribe and everything, and oh, they live in this very remote area, and you're going in, gunning them down, as it were. Again, I don't think it was intentional, but I do think they skirted the line, as it were, between insensitivity and what they could get away with. So it's a complex issue, isn't it? I feel as if on the one hand, people can easily wave it off and say, no, it's not racist, but just because it's not intended doesn't mean that it's not uncomfortable.
No, 100%. That's what makes it so difficult, is that I don't think there's a complete right or wrong to it. It really is how you feel. And I don't think either way there's a right or a wrong way to feel about it. You know, this is just, you and I have given our opinions on how we feel about it, but there's obviously different opinions out there and that are no less valid than ours. So yeah, it's a hard one. And again, I agree with you. I don't think it's ever trying to intentionally be racist. But again, that doesn't, you don't have to be intentional for something to be racist. There is stuff in there that I think is unfortunately problematic. So it is a legacy of the game. If they ever did remake, I don't know if Capcom ever planned to remake Resident Evil 5 or not, but it at least would be interesting from a kind of academic point of view. It'd be interesting to see what they decided to do about that. Being that it probably, for all the stuff we talk about with it, people not liking the direction it was taking the franchise in and everything, the allegations of racism, I think, are the game's, unfortunately, one of the game's most lasting legacies and its most problematic aspect. So again, I don't know quite how you would tackle that, because to be honest, whatever way you tackle it, you're going to annoy some people for whatever reason. So it'll be a tricky one.
As I said, as of this episode, there hasn't been any announcement or plans to remake 5. I think, and I'm speculating here, but I think they're going in the direction of creating Resident Evil 9, which will be interesting to see where they take that. But yeah, again, as you were saying, you summed it up perfectly there. There's no real right or wrong answer, but I felt as if it was an important thing to talk about rather than, just brushing it aside and saying, wow, Wesker's goofy, he's got no shirt on. We know that. We know this game is 100% goofy. Even the story is really over the top. As we said, you've got the return of Wesker, who is now like a drugged up Blade looking guy, which is very, very bizarre, isn't it? Granted, I'm coming into the franchise late, but I didn't expect that. And then when I saw it, I was like, oh, that's why it looks like he's from the Matrix. It was very strange pivot, because as we were talking about there, I think the majority of the game takes place in these very unique and, let's face it, gorgeous looking settings in Africa. But then we get to that point of a Resident Evil game where it's like, oh, you're nearing the end, we have to stick you in a lab, and you're like, no, let me out of the lab. And you have to fight your way to Wesker, you have to fight Excella, I think her name is, who's his henchwoman and looks like she's dressed as a Greek goddess or something for some weird reason. And you've got the sleazy businessman that you have to fight against as well. Resident Evil loves their fish monsters, don't they?
It's a wee bit of a staple.
Yeah, it's getting there, definitely. But yeah, see, in terms of the story, before we move on to 6, because I know we'll have a lot to say about that, but what did you think of the story overall for this? Because I feel as if this is quite contentious as well, seeing as it's pulling elements from especially the first few games.
It's an interesting one. Overall, I think the story is quite meh, to be honest. I mean, my counterpoint would be I don't think there's that many good Resident Evil stories anyway. Again, my own personal opinion, I don't think any of the mainline Resident Evil games have that great a story. To be honest, I don't think that's where the strength of the series has ever lain. 5 certainly does have a lot of very over-the-top elements to it, and particularly with the villains transforming themselves into mutated monsters is quite over-the-top in this one. There's some parts of it I like. Chris Redfield is my favourite Resident Evil protagonist. Now, maybe that's partly because Resident Evil 5 was my first game, so obviously Chris is a character that, the first character I played as and stuff, so perhaps I've got a fondness from that kind of angle. I like parts of it. I like the whole, it's building up to this kind of culmination of the Chris-Wesker relationship and conflict. I do like that it's kind of built around that, and that's what it sort of builds towards. I do like parts of it. I really like Wesker's portrayal in this. Maybe again because it's the first game I played, but I really like Wesker's portrayal, and I really like his design, his mannerisms, the way he speaks and everything. I just think it's great. I really enjoy it. I'm trying to formulate my thoughts on Shiva, to be honest, because on one level, I do like the fact there's a kind of partner thing to it. I think what maybe slightly helps the game is that in it, against any kind of allegations of racism are that, you do have a black main character in it, like a playable protagonist as well. Again, maybe that does help a bit if you want to look at it as maybe not as racist, perhaps, or maybe it doesn't matter to you anyway, but I think it was important to have an element of that in there. I don't know if she was the most developed character, unfortunately. Now, part of this, I think, does stem from the fact that I do think it does seem that the co-op elements were a more later addition, so were sort of added in halfway through. Or perhaps if they'd been something that had been planned at the beginning, perhaps we could have got a more fleshed out character. I think there's nothing wrong with Shiva. I just don't think it's as well developed, and I wish there was maybe more put into kind of her motivations, and maybe if she was given them slightly more interesting ties to maybe the overall Umbrella, Wesker, Ouroboros plotline. But I still think she's fine for what she is. I generally like the ideas. Maybe it's just in the execution. I think the story perhaps isn't done the best. And again, I would probably say for me that's a criticism I could level against most mainline Resident Evil games personally. But I do think 5 does stand out for perhaps its more over-the-top elements, unfortunately. I think some of them work well. We'll probably come on to it, but I really do like a lot of the boss fights in this. But perhaps in some of the other kind of story beats, it probably doesn't work as well, to be honest.
Yeah, you make a fantastic point there, because one of the things that I have to say kind of hurts the game as a whole, or rather not hurts the game, but hurts the narrative of the game, is just the bombastic elements. And leaving the boulder in the room aside here, yeah, I do feel like you've got Sheva, who is an absolutely fantastic character, but I do agree there's some elements where it's like you wish there was more development. I think her backstory is that she came from a place where Umbrella decided to do experiments on her hometown, and then that obviously led to her being quite peeved, to put it very nicely, be very peeved against Umbrella, and then eventually that led to her joining the BSAA later on. And I think she has a great character, and Chris as well. I like Chris's development in this because, as we were saying, let's face it, the development of the characters in the first game was paper thin, wasn't it? It wasn't the best. It was good, it was serviceable in the first game, but you've got Chris as the main hero, you've got Jill as the main hero. They were two sides of the same coin, so they weren't overly different. But then you get to this, and of course by 2009 you have a lot more narrative driven games along with your action. It's not enough to have fun gameplay, you have to have that story element to prop it up. Having Chris try to hunt down Jill, I really liked that element of it, and I liked how supportive Sheva was as well to that, to be like, nah, we're going to burn this down together. Jill, on the other hand, I have conflicting things about that, because I like the fact that we're trying to find her, but the whole mind control thing and dyeing her hair blonde, I'm sure there's a Resident Evil fan out there to say actually the thing in her chest turned her into a Wesker type person, and that turned her hair blonde or something. I don't know. Do you know the reason for that?
I have not a clue, but let's say it was something to do with that chest implant thing.
Yeah, let's say it was the B virus, the blonde virus.
Or maybe she just decided to change it herself. Who knows? Perhaps she felt a change was necessary.
And the fact that she stole one of Wesker's bodysuits as well, fully with heels, would you believe? Which I was kind of like, that seems like the least tactical thing you could have added to this uniform. When people look at a design and they go, that's a very human design, every time I look at a character in this game, I think, wow, that's a very Capcom design. It's very Capcom coded, as it were, because you've got her and the bodysuit and everything, but then you've got Wesker, as we were saying, dressed as cross between a Blade character and a Matrix character. It is so surreal to watch. You're like, what is going on here? But I have to say, he actually made me scream in terror in this game. And I think, remember when we were playing it and I was like, oh, what do we do for this boss fight? You're like, yeah, just run and gun and everything. I'm like, that'll be fine. And I saw him at the end of a corridor and I'm shooting away thinking, that's fine, pop a few bullets and I'm maybe fine. I didn't realise he had super speed, and my soul left my body when he came charging at me. This blonde, hunky man running at me like Johnny Bravo and I was like, Jesus Christ. So apologies for rupturing your eardrums at that part.
For all the kind of bombast of Resident Evil 5, and perhaps it is ridiculous at some points, and where it doesn't work, like I think maybe the fight with the giant doesn't really work, to be honest, in the way that I think it worked quite well in Resident Evil 4. I don't think it does quite the same here. On rails scene just before that in the vehicle with the enemies and the bikes and everything, that's a bit hit and miss as well. But where the bombast works, I really do think a lot of these boss fights are a lot of fun to play. Not only just 'cause I think some of them are quite epic, but as well, just those moments. The one thing I always remember about Resident Evil 5, I always remember that the first fight with Wesker, where it's Wesker and Jill versus Chris and Shiva. And that exact, as you said, that exact bit of Wesker's like dashing around like he's using Blink from the Dishonored games, charging around the place, and he's stalking you and chasing you down, you know, if you're playing as Chris. I just think it adds a lot of fun. It's not really horror, but I think it can provoke these kind of moments of terror. But I think it's that kind of fun terror where you're like panicking and stuff, and, you know, then your co-op partner, if you're playing with somebody else, is trying to come and help you out if they can, you know, at the same time. So I think it makes for a lot of fun. I think that's why I have a particular fondness for this game, and particularly for kind of Wesker and his design and everything. Just I think it leads to these very kind of fun, cool moments.
As you said, for all the bombast and action moments, it is very memorable, isn't it? Especially with the iconic Wesker line of the 7 minutes. 7 minutes is all I have to spend with you. And then he just beats the shit out of you. And you're like, oh no, Wesker, I'm sorry, please. Yamaro. And it's like, no, you're... You signed up for this. That's some people's fantasies, my horror. Okay, it was not a good time. Especially, see when he just teleports out, as you were saying with the Blink and Disordered, where he just appears, and it's like, Jesus Christ, my soul. Honestly, my soul was just hovering at that point above my body. It's like, yeah, I'm not coming back until you finish this boss fight. I keep leaving and coming back. You know, you've got that, and I will agree with you. I feel as if the giant fight didn't land. The boat chase, that was okay. The on-rail shooting sections. Again, I think they wanted a more grandiose story. The fact that they were going to Africa, so they wanted to take advantage of the iconography, which some bits obviously did it better than others, and I liked the development into the lore of it, with the progenitor virus coming into it, and learning a bit more of Oswald Spencer as a guy. I feel a bit iffy with him getting killed off in this game, but it was Wesker, 7 minutes, you know. In fact, he did it less than 7 minutes, but yeah, then you've got moments that you think, wow, this is cool, this is awesome, this is great, and then other moments where you're like, yeah, I don't see why we need a temple under of this village. I wasn't too fond of those moments. I felt as if when we were playing through it, I was like, yeah, this is quite tedious. And yeah, some moments landed and others didn't, which I know is such a reductive way to summarise this game, but I genuinely think that there were some excellent moments that I think should be praised in it, but other moments where I was just like, yeah, this could have been an email, the game, you know what I mean?
I think it's fair to say I like the game overall, but I think it's fair to say it's far from perfect. It's not blemish-free at all. Like, it's got plenty of warts, from some problematic moments, as we've mentioned, to, I think, some kind of failed attempts at very bombastic gameplay. I'm not totally... Obviously, this game as well, I feel like, started to kind of de-emphasize inventory. Well, that's unfair to say, because inventory management is still a part of it. It just... I don't know. I don't quite like it as well, because it's not like with 4 or something where you're like, you have a briefcase and you can build it up, you know, everything, or it's not like the old games where you're running between save rooms to get item boxes and everything like that. And it's a much more limited, much more focused one. And I think it makes it a bit duller, to be honest. You know, I don't think it makes it as interesting as those other elements in older games, and what I think in some of the more recent games as well. So it's not perfect. It's not perfect at all. And I said the story is what it is. I don't think the story is anything special. I think one thing as well, maybe one bigger problem I have with this game is I think it does lack some more memorable environment. You and I were talking a few weeks back, I think. I've not long completed the Resident Evil 4 remake, and I was talking about how much I love the castle environment in that. I think it's like such a standout high point of the game, and I love the way it's interconnected, and I love the environment, I love the enemies and everything. I think it's really cool. I think 5 lacks that. I kind of like the fact that 5 does take a slightly different approach, where a lot of it is in broad daylight. That's quite different to, a lot of the previous Resident Evil games, certainly. Adds a kind of new element. And I do think some of the opening scenes are quite good. I do like some of that. As much as a kind of obviously trying to copy 4 in some ways, I do think it does it quite well. But I don't think the environments are a standout thing. It's more corridor-esque. It's more just designed to kind of funnel you down from point A to point B and get you into the combat and everything, which is fine. I think it works for this game, but I think it does unfortunately mean that I don't look back on any area. The things I look back on are the moments. I think about the kind of boss fights with Wesker and everything. I don't really think about, I love exploring or being in that in particular environment. So again, long-winded way of me saying it's not a perfect perfect game at all. But in spite of that, I still had a lot of fun playing this again with you. And I think the co-op was a bit of a divisive point, and we can argue maybe it does help to reduce the horror in it, but I think the co-op adds a lot to it, and I think there's still a lot of value in this game as a co-op experience. I had a lot of fun with it. I think it, provides a lot of tense moments. I think it provides some good fun action. And I just think it's a bit of a blast to play with somebody, to be honest.
No, I'm totally with you there, because the co-op mechanic was quite divisive. I think at the time probably, but especially in hindsight now, because other than probably, I think 5 and 6 are the main co-op ones, not including any spin-offs or side modes, that kind of thing. But for this game, yeah, they definitely wanted to emphasise having you play with other people, having to play with your friends, but if you didn't, then that's perfectly fine as well. I think if I played this game on my own, I don't think I would have enjoyed it the same, to be honest, because half of it, and I'm not just saying this because you're here, but I genuinely think half of the fun from this game was playing with yourself. The fact that we got through so many situations where we're laughing, we're joking, where we're wincing at some cultural insensitivities, but at the end of the day, we're like, oh, this is such a great game. And yeah, again, you've got the very memorable moments, like as we said, the 7 minutes, and I'll always do the voice for that, apologies, but you've got that. You've got the darker tone at the beginning, but then that's kind of thrown away for a gigantic fish mutation of the sleazy businessman. Then you have to fight someone on the ship, which again is quite interesting, I've got to say, because I played Resident Evil Revelations before I played Resident Evil 5, or at least before I got to that part in Resident Evil 5, and I thought, oh, this looks like an asset swap, which obviously I can't hold that against Capcom, because, it's their game, and if it's easy enough to take a ship from one game and put it in another, I'm not going to beat them down for that. But yeah, there was a lot that I loved and a lot that I disliked, but I feel as if it's better as a co-op experience overall. As a single player experience, I think I would have hated this game genuinely, and I played through the DLCs and I did enjoy them for the most part. So the DLC, I mean, is the prequel to the game where you, as Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, you go into the Spencer Mansion 2.0, as it were, to try and find Oswald Spencer. You have to fight Wesker again. I nearly got my ass kicked, but fortunately survived. Then you've got the other one with the Desperate Escape, where you escape with Jill and Josh through the remains of the Umbrella facility. And that was a lot of fun, and that was interesting. And again, I loved that different angle of the BSAA, that it wasn't just, oh, it's just American, we're just going to crash in and take over. I loved that part of it. But yeah, unfortunately, that's not really something that carried on to the later games, and something we will talk about, of course, in our 7 and 8 retrospective. And the game that, of course, we are about to move on to, which is Resident Evil 6, aka the game that has a giraffe getting inappropriate actions made against it with a human silhouette. And yeah, I'm going to be honest, see, at the time when you first saw that logo, were you just as horrified as I was?
Do you know what? I don't think I'd seen the logo until I'd heard the sort of comments about it. So I don't know if I actually was ever able to view this logo without that image in my head, unfortunately. So I don't know if I could ever say I had an ever unbiased look at it. I mean, I don't know. Once you have that image in your head, I think it's very difficult, and it's impossible, I think, to not see it, unfortunately. Apparently Capcom didn't see it, so there you go.
Well, you say that, but apparently they did tweet out and they just put the one word that said giraffe in it. I don't know when that was, but I'm going to be honest, I think if they didn't know at the time, they certainly know now. Yeah, that'll be an interesting one for them to remake. But ironically enough, this game is also controversial, but for completely different reasons. We spent a good while diving into the complex controversies of the 5th game, whether it was inappropriate or not. But for this game, this is just a whole, to borrow a phrase from a TV show, it's like a whole bouquet of whoopsie daisies, isn't it? Again, I went into this game very open-minded, thinking, what is the worst that could happen in this game? What is the worst? Surely it's not as bad, because, I mean, you know me very well, Adam. I am a Sonic fan. I've been through the wars. I know how bad these types of games can get, but honestly, nothing prepared me for what was about to come. And of course, we get into Resident Evil 6, which is an absolute dumpster fire. Is that right in saying? Or am I being hyperbolic as usual?
This one's hard to talk about for a completely different reason. You're right, this is, in many ways, putting aside the very real controversy of 5, 5 and the very important controversy of 5. In a more sort of entertainment, let's have a laugh about it, this is the most controversial, I think, of the mainline games, because you're right, it is the subject of a lot of ridicule, a lot of apathy, a fair bit of hate as well, if we're honest, this game. That being said, it does have quite a loyal legion of fans who really like it and will fight tooth and nail, that people just didn't get it at the time, and that actually, once you understand what this game was supposed to be about and how you're supposed to play it, then it is like an absolute gem. I think, and to be honest, for me, this happens a lot with these type of games. I think if you get a game that's either the subject of quite high-profile criticism or high-profile praise, obviously that tends to sort of create the narrative and skew the narrative in the public kind of conscience. But I do think as well, you do tend to get a backlash. You will get a sizable contingent of people who, if it's a game that's highly praised, will be like, no, tell you what, this is overrated, it's not that good, and here's why. While, similarly, you get a game that is high profile or seen as a high profile failure, the subject of fairly vocal criticism. You'll get a large legion of people who say, nope, you just don't get it, this is actually a gem, people, you just don't understand it, and they will, say, fight tooth and nail to tell you why it is a game that should be better remembered and has kind of been unfairly treated. And we can see that all over the place. I mean, the other one that springs to my mind is the when Castlevania went onto the Nintendo 64. Its Nintendo 64 version is usually quite highly critically panned. The Angry Video Game Nerd did a particularly brutal takedown of it, but that has subsequently led to a large group of people being like, no, this is actually a great game and here's why. I think Resident Evil 6 has that, to be honest. And it's been a long time. I've only ever played through this game once, and that was a good few years ago. And to be honest, I was thinking about playing through it again for this. I actually ended up not doing that, so I decided instead to kind of dive in to people's thoughts about this. And it's interesting to see how split the things are. I still would say overall people are probably more critical of it than they praise it, but I think it's interesting that it does have this kind of split reputation, and it does seem to be that a lot of people either fall in the category of no, this is terrible, or else people or kind of laugh at it, or people kind of fall into this is actually amazing, and how could you ever say it's a bad game?
Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating to me when I saw that, because I was genuinely like, this is a game you're defending? And again, I came into this with an open mind. I was like, okay, there are some elements that I appreciate, and I do like the fact that they just decided to go all out for this game. Unfortunately, it doesn't pay off, but of course we will get into that in a minute. But there was a lot in this game that I just think, what were they thinking? Again, not to coin the phrase from the Angry Video Game Nerd, but genuinely, what were they thinking for certain elements, for the characters, for the story? The gameplay itself, I will admit, was great. I had someone on Twitter not yell at me, but they were quite, not annoyed, but they were quite peeved that I was criticising the game when the AI was, in their words, not mine, the AI was supposed to be amazing and everything, and it was a step up from 5. Honestly, couldn't see it as a single player of this game. I feel as if this is one of the games that they definitely, if 5 was, oh, we're going to add co-op and just see how we run with this, 6 was a game that they definitely had in mind of, oh, this is going to be a co-op game first and foremost, and I'm going to be honest, I hate it. I hate the co-opness of it. Again, see if you and I were playing it and we went through it, we could make some jokes. It's like big, goofy, fun action. But objectively, do you know what it is? And I don't mean this as a compliment. It is the Sonic Adventure of this series. And when I say that, I don't mean Sonic Adventure's a bad game or anything. What I mean is they've taken a central narrative and they've split it into different perspectives. So you play as those different perspectives. You get to see it. You play as Leon, who is trying to uncover a conspiracy theory, and he's helped by his mysterious girlfriend, Ada Wong, which I know she's not technically his girlfriend, but you know what I mean. You've got Jake and Sherry, who are trying to figure out the secret to antibodies within Jake, and we will get on to Jake because he is a particularly fascinating character in this story. We've got Chris and Piers, who that's the heavy action BSAA part of it, which again, it made me feel as if I wanted to play an action game focused on the BSAA. It didn't make me want to play a Resident Evil game, if that makes sense. It didn't feel like a Resident Evil game at that point. And then last but not least, we've got Ada, who is the weirdest part of this game entirely. The reason that this kicks off in the first place. If I could summarise it, I would say that the game is too long, too tedious, and is just overly repetitive. And you know, some people love that about this game, the fact that there's so much much additions to the lore, to the backstories and everything. There's certain elements I do like. For example, the whole idea of Chris having this survivor's guilt, much like Leon, ironically enough, where he is absolutely in this fit of depression, and then sadly at the end of it, he loses one of the only people who believe in him, and then he has to continue on for his sake. I loved that part of the story. I genuinely thought that was so well done. For Leon's story, I was really annoyed. I'm going to be honest, man. I was just so annoyed. The central story beats were, oh, Leon, you're here. What happened? Oh, well, let me explain later. And then it takes them ages to actually explain what you already know, if that makes sense. Funny enough, I felt as if Jake's storyline was pretty compelling. Ada's was just an absolute omnishambles. But sorry, I have rambled long enough. Flipping it back onto you, what did you think of the story, both as a kind of first impression and revisiting it for this episode when you were researching it?
I would agree with you. I think there are some interesting elements. I also agree that I quite like some of the themes of the Chris Piers storyline. I do think there's interesting stuff there. Again, it doesn't maybe come together in the execution, but at least I think there's interesting ideas there. On one level, I actually like the ideas of them having these sort of branching narratives and having these kind of 4 separate campaigns. You know, I like that idea. I think the problem becomes in when they try and force them to mingle together, and you keep crossing paths with people and they try and get you to see things from a different perspective. I don't mean like view story things from a different perspective. I literally mean see events from a different perspective, somewhere else or whatever. But that I think is a problem, and I think there was a bit too much of that. I almost wonder if maybe trying to do something a bit more separate might have been better. Again, there's some interesting stuff. I mean, I think the characters are a bit of a mix as well. Obviously, you've got favourites like Chris and Leon and Ada in there. I think maybe some of the new characters are a bit more of a mixed bag of what people think about them. I've seen quite wildly different interpretations of Piers, for instance. Like I've seen some people say they really liked him as a counterpoint to Chris and thought that dynamic played off really well, while I've seen other people say he's very annoying, he's very bland, adds nothing to it. So I think just it highlights again the very mixed reception of this game. And again, maybe that's just people have different opinions of things, and generally, but I think it really is highlighted in this game. The general problem with 6, I think, is the length of its story and the length of its campaign. Now, if you really like this game, then it's great this much material. There's about 20 hours, I think, worth of gameplay in this. Probably maybe more, maybe slightly less depending on how you play, but it's a sizable chunk of content you get, which is in one way is great, I guess, if you want to go down the value for money angle, and there's lots to this game, there's no denying that. If you really like the game, you really get into the story, you really like the gameplay, then there's lots here to get into, so that's great. But if, for instance, obviously the way you experienced it, if I'm honest, when I played it, I didn't really enjoy this game that much at all, to be honest. When I played it, it becomes a slog when there's that much to get through. In many ways, it doesn't feel, sorry, I know I'm straying away from the story now, but it doesn't feel that there's that huge amount of difference in the gameplay as well, I think, which is a shame, and maybe seems like something they maybe more wanted to try and get, but I think just weren't able to just pull it off, ran out of time. And I think the scale of this game is something to consider, that I think they maybe were trying to be a bit too ambitious, Capcom, in this. And even with a development staff of 600, I think this was a struggle for them to pull this all together. So maybe we should celebrate what they actually managed to do, because I think it is a relatively, again, it's very bombastic, the storyline, it's very ridiculous. I struggle to remember a lot of the kind of moment to moment, if I'm honest. I remember some of the big points about it, but it's very over the top, it's very bombastic. It sort of takes what was happening in 4 and 5, and I suppose in all the Resident Evil games to an extent, they're all quite bombastic in their own way, but it really runs with that. But maybe we could say it pushes it maybe too far in this case, and I think that seems a bit of the consensus around it.
Oh no, 100%. Basically, they took all of the action elements of 5 and then they just ramped it up to 11, and they just said, you know what, run free. You can have as many Michael Bay explosions as you want. You can have all of the absolute ridiculous elements of it. And don't get me wrong, Resident Evil has an underlying silliness. One of my favourite scenes, and it's something that I came across completely by chance on YouTube, is a scene where Chris confronts Wesker in the original game. And I think I sent this to you to ask if it was real. And it's, the scene where Chris starts laughing at Wesker, and Wesker says in the most pitiful voice, "Stop it." He's like, "You're pitiful, Wesker." That is so silly and so dumb, but at the same time, it adds that charm to the game. Do you know what I mean? That kind of, it is silly, but it's also got this serious narrative underneath, because for all the silly moments in the first game, you've got untold horrors like the Hunters, Lisa Trevor, which was absolutely terrifying. You've got the Crimson Head, you've got all of that. And even in 5, going back to that one, despite the fact we said, oh, it's a bit silly with the Weskers, 7 minutes and everything else, you've still got these poor villagers in West Africa who have been infected by the Plagas virus. And that is horrifying how you see them mutate and evolve. And, you know, depending on the strain, whether it's type 2 or 3, they transform into horrible creatures, and then you've got bugs and you've got huge alligators and things. There are horrifying elements woven within it, but I feel as if while in the 5th game they're overshadowed, like the horror elements are overshadowed by the silliness, this game puts the silliness at the forefront and then hides it behind a lot of repetitiveness. Oh, you've got to find 3 keys. Oh, you've got to pull 3 switches. That is the same repetitive game loop that you've got in each story. And I'm sorry, I was so bored when I was playing this game. And it didn't help because I was playing it on my Steam Deck and it kept crashing every so often. And it wouldn't save it at the checkpoint that it saved at initially. So then that's pushing me back another 10-15 minutes that I have to repeat and do all over again. And it was a slog. It was a struggle. And I know some people might be saying, well, it's better if you play it on an Xbox or if you play it on the PC rather than the Steam Deck. But honestly, it was just such a slog getting through this game. And I appreciate, as I was saying, the grandiose nature of it. I appreciate the vision, as it were. Because one of the stories that I was really impressed with, and I don't know how you feel about this, but with Jake in this game, because when I first saw Jake, I rolled my eyes because I genuinely thought, oh great, this is a stereotypical character of the time, especially with Infamous and games like that, where you thought, oh great, we're going to have this baldy, angsty, brooding guy. But he was surprisingly one of the best characters of 6, and I'm going to stand by that because I genuinely did not expect to like him as much as I thought I would. And although it's silly, the spoilers reveal that he is Wesker's son and everything, and he has to deal with the sins of the father, which is actually an interesting theme. Again, going back to that idea that there are good themes in this game, that he has teamed up with Sherry Birkin, who Sherry is also a victim of this idea that her father, William Birkin, created the G virus, and, you know, she's having to not pay for it, but, you know, she has to live with the fact that she knows that her father's done this to the world and everything. And it's a bit like Jake as well. He is just a mercenary with no home, and his twist, other than being Wesker's son, is of course that he has antibodies, that he's not able to be infected with the game's new virus, which is the C virus. It stands for chrysalid virus, I think. But he is an interesting character, and I do think it was quite clever that they paired those two together. Not gonna lie, I didn't like some of the more problematic moments when they kind of sexualised Sherry in some scenes, and you were like, oh, well, wonderful, thanks Capcom, 10 out of 10. For legal reasons, that is definitely a joke. Sort your shit out, Capcom. But did you feel that way as well for Jake's storyline, or were you kind of indifferent when you played it?
To be honest, I think I was a bit indifferent by this point. So if I remember rightly, the way I played these stories, I do wonder if the order you play the stories in makes a difference. And I'll be interested to hear the order you played them in. So I started with Chris's story, then I played Ada's, then I played Jake's, and I finished with Leon's, I'm pretty sure. So I'll be honest, I had found Ada's story very much of a, and I found Chris's story with a slog as well, but I very much had found Ada's story quite a grind. So I was quite done with this game by the time I got to Jake's story. So I wasn't really giving much to the game, no matter what it was kind of giving back. I do agree, I do think it's interesting the teaming Jake up with Sherry, because I do think it's interesting to have 2 children of villains, for lack of a better word. I do think that's interesting. And I think there's some interesting stuff there. I can't help but agree with you a little bit. Like, there's something a bit cringy about Jake's design, and especially when you read some of the developer commentary in the run up to this game, they developed, where was I reading it? They developed Jake because they wanted a character that would appeal to, for lack of a better term, the youth of 2012. So Jake Miller was designed to be somebody today's youth can empathise with. That's a bit of a cringe, well, to me, it's a bit of a cringeworthy tagline for this character. I would never say he's the worst character in this series, or like the character I hated or anything like that. It's a bit meh for me, but I think there is some kind of interesting stuff there.
Well, funny enough, and this is me totally not bringing up my list of games from 2012, but yeah, it's funny you say that they designed them around one that the kids of 2012 would sympathise with and relate to, because, man, I can see the inspiration, if that's the correct term. You've got Max Payne 3 coming out that year, you've got Far Cry 3, you've got Assassin's Creed 3, lots of 3s, surprisingly. Well, I say that, but there's also Black Ops 2 for the Call of Duty series. Ironically enough, the Revelation series for Resident Evil also came out in the same year, but that is, of course, a story for another day. But you've got Hitman Absolution as well. I mean, you've got Mass Effect 3 as well with and I'm talking about the default Mailship character, and I don't think Mailship is anywhere near that level of underbaked or anything, but design-wise, I can see why they went with that. There's also an interesting game as well, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this as well. But sorry, just before I go on to say that, in case you're wondering, I went the basic route. I went Leon, Chris, Jake, and then Ada. Totally agree. Ada's story is so slog-worthy. It's just so boring. And something interesting about Ada's story as well is I think it was on disc DLC at the time. Then I think people found out, they got quite angry. They weren't happy with the demo either, so Capcom eventually released it. And I think the idea was you had to play the first 3 campaigns and then you could unlock Ada's campaign. But I think now they've just unlocked them all at the very beginning, so you can play them in whatever order you want. Personally, I think the best order, if you are going to replay this, is Leon, Chris, Jake, and then Ada. But if you've got 100 billion hours to spare to play this, sure. But one particular example I want to bring your attention to, and it's a very favourite's probably the wrong word, but very fond game that you and I have played, and that is Spec Ops The Line. There is actually a surprising similarity between the two. Have you noticed this before I go on?
Is it the way they open?
Yep, bingo.
There we go.
If you read, and I can't believe I'm diving into this again, but in preparation when I was recording my solo episode for Spec Ops, I read the biography of Walt Williams, who is the writer for Spec Ops The Line, called Significant Zero. That is a fascinating read, by the way. I would wholly recommend it. But at the very beginning, he talks about one very particular change, and I've got kind of mixed feelings about it myself, but a very particular change that the higher-ups in the studio made. So, you know, Spec Ops The Line was a very psychologically driven, no horrors of war, that kind of thing. But then the studios apparently turned round to Walt and said, listen, we want the helicopter chase scene near the end of the game. We want that at the very beginning of the game. And then, we can flash back and see where we're coming from, that kind of thing. And he was obviously outraged by this, and that's what led him to write in the, again, I don't agree with this personally, but the whole thing that, anything after the helicopter crash was just a dream or a hallucination, and you're like, yeah, I don't like that. But again, story for another day. But I feel as if it's kind of a similar opening here with Resident Evil 6, because it takes you through the mechanics as Leon and Helena, and you're running through the streets of Shanghai trying to avoid zombies and whatnot, and then you get the big explosion. You literally have to run away from an explosion. I think it's the dumbest thing ever, and as someone who loves these kind of silly moments, I feel as if there's way too many of them in this game that really sully the experience, and then you have to play through it again, so you're like, well, what's the point of flashing forward, flashing back? It seemed to be the thing, wasn't it, at the time, that they wanted this big, bombastic action hook at the start of the game, otherwise, gamers aren't going to like it, they're going to think this is a game for babies, that kind of thing.
I would agree with that as a point. I think as well, we talked about this with Resident Evil 5, in the way that it was starting to become influenced by trends in the video gaming space, in 2009. And I think Resident Evil 6 is even more that case. I mean, it's worth saying that Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 5 sold very well. For a long time, it was Capcom's best-selling game ever. It had shifted a lot of units. It had received mostly positive reviews. So obviously, maybe some fans of the series didn't like it, but generally, from a lot of critics and stuff, it had done fairly well, and, added into that, its blockbuster sales. Obviously, Capcom felt like they were in the right direction, and, the trends that we talked about that were present in 2009 were even more present by 2012, obviously. The military, as much as we were maybe starting to go into more sort of futuristic terrain, the military shooter was still very popular. The AAA action adventure was taking off even more. Obviously, Uncharted 3 in the year before. You mentioned we have Max Payne 3 this year. Again, Prototype 2 came out as well, as you say, and everything. So, the action adventure AAA genre really was taking off. And I think there's quite a well-known well-known statement from Capcom sort of during the development of Resident Evil 6. And I think in the lead up to its release, they talked about that they thought the survival horror market was too niche, and that's why they were going for a more action-adventure type game. And I think it's very understandable, and I think to an extent they are right, and they certainly were right in 2012. Survival horror, I don't think, has ever particularly been the most popular genre. Like, it has done well, there's no denying that, and it certainly was a very popular genre in the kind of late 90s, but it had fallen away. Like, action-adventure very much, and shooters became the more popular one. And now, again, whether you say they were too quick to turn their back on survival horror, and perhaps they were, it is obviously a genre that has survived, and it's thriving again now in many ways. But I think they had sort of identified what was going on in the gaming space and were trying to orientate their game towards it. I think, again, it comes down to a question of scale. I think it was just too big. I think 5, for me, works a bit better because it's not too long. I don't think for me, it doesn't outstay its welcome too long, whereas I think 6 does outstay it. For me, anyway, outstayed its welcome by quite a while. And I think quite a lot of people feel that way about it. Again, if you really like it, then great, there's that much content, but it just feels like I can see what they were trying to do, but it just didn't manage to pull it off. But I think it's worth saying as well that Resident Evil 6 sold really well as well. And, still now, if you look at Capcom's best-selling games of all time, Resident Evil 6 is number 9 on that list, so it's still in the top 10. Resident Evil 5 is number 8, so they're both still in the top 10 there. They have been overtaken now by some of the more recent Resident Evil games, but, they still sold a lot at the time. Unfortunately for Resident Evil 6, as much as it sold well, it didn't do enough to recoup the costs for Capcom. Obviously, it was as I mentioned, it was a staff of 600 people who were developing it, so there was a lot of cost that went into it. And even though it had sold well and was a very high-selling game for them, it just wasn't enough, I think, to completely recoup that cost, so it didn't end up being the kind of success that they hoped. But that switch to Action Adventure did work, did drive sales, just obviously not enough for them they needed.
Yeah, because it's an interesting point that you made there about the viability of horror games within the gaming market, because don't get me wrong, I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert of horror games because I've got into them fairly late in my life. I've got my favourites, I've got my less than favourable ones, but I do think that although I don't agree with the way they took Resident Evil 6 and made it more into action horror, mainly action, not so much horror, I feel as if in a way it was almost a necessity that they had to move away from that, or at the very least either go full in survival horror or go full in action. This kind of hybrid purgatory in between just doesn't work for this game. Because again, as I said, there's a lot of themes and things that do work in this game, but for every moment where you think, oh, this is a really interesting moment, and oh, what's going to happen with this? Then all of a sudden you've got a gratuitous shot of, for example, Helena's sister who has been experimented on. It should be like a really sad scene, and she evolves into a half-naked lady, essentially, half-naked lady monster. And you're like, okay, right, that's the theme you're going for. Whereas then you get to Simmons, who is the villain for the most part, and his reasons for being a villain is just so dumb. It's just, he worked with Ada Wong, once, twice maybe, grew infatuated with her, and then decided to try and literally remake Ada Wong from test subjects, and that's where the C virus kind of came from. And I hate the C virus, I'm going to be honest. It's one of the dumbest virus strains in this particular series. The idea is interesting, but when you find out why it was made, it's not even like, oh, it's a clever idea that people develop into these hideous creatures. It's like, no, you're literally turning them into insect people or half-naked people. And again, this is obviously how viruses technically work in the real world. There's mutations and whatnot, but I don't know why someone said, oh, I want to spend billions of dollars because I'm secretly part of this shady organisation called the Family. My forefathers, they've been part of the Family, and oh, we're going to spend millions on this virus. And you're like, but why though? But why? Just to have Ada Wong 2.0? And it's just, I don't know, I feel as if some bits are written by a competent writer, and then other bits are written by a teenager, if that makes sense. It flips between the two so much, and it really makes it redundant at times, you know, where you think, oh, the game's ended. Oh no, the villain's alive. Oh, shoot them. And no more is that apparent than with the fight you have against Ustanak, who is the tyrant of this game. And the idea is cool. You know, he's quite a relatively intimidating foe because you have to run away from him. You can't really fight him until the very end. And as stupid as it is pretty cool that Jake is pulling up fisticuffs against him, that kind of thing. But the one thing that really annoys me is just, you know, the fact you keep killing him, he goes into the lava, and then somehow he keeps surviving, and you're just like, the game doesn't know when to end. It just keeps going on and on and on. A bit like myself, but I digress. It keeps going on. You think, when is this game going to end? And again, with the Ada stuff, am I just clutching my pearls here when I say there's a lot of weird choices in objectification when, for the female characters, and I've seen the concept art of some of the alternative outfits that we're going to give to some people. Let me say the female characters do not come out of it well. Again, it's just, I'm not mad, Capcom, I'm just very, very disappointed. But yeah, there's no consistency for this particular virus because you've got half naked people, as I said, and then the other half are bug creatures. And Simmons himself, he gets injected and he literally turns into a Digimon because he turns into a dog, then he turns into a T-Rex, and then he turns into a giant fly. And I'm going to be honest, it went from, oh, that's cool, to, oh, the writer's teenage son got into the writing room again and just wrote this. Again, am I clutching my pearls at this, or do you think that's a fair assessment?
Like, I certainly, the bit that sticks out in my mind is the bit with Jake and Sherry in the changing room or whatever it is. That bit sticks out in the mind, and I don't think it's great. I mean, I think it's a little bit, unfortunately, of a trend with some of these games. Even looking at some of the stuff about the development of Resident Evil 5, and they're talking about making Shiva, they really want to stress, oh, we want to make this beautiful woman, but who's also like a powerful fighter and stuff. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, I suppose, as a concept. But you can never help but feel that there is always this sort of undertone to the way they want to create female characters in this series at points. Yeah, again, it's maybe not something that I'm particularly a big fan of either, to be honest. I suppose, at the very least, like, I do think they do try to give the female characters some stuff to do and give them important roles in the plot. I suppose at least, you know, whether we think it works all the time or not, I suppose is a different matter, but at least they are there to have a role. It's not just pure sort of eye candy or fan service type thing. There is at least reasons for them to be, you know, present in the story and everything. But I do think it's a fair point that some of it's not great, I guess, depending on your viewpoint. Like, I do think it can be problematic, to be honest.
Again, it's between the boulder and the hard place with this one, because I don't want to be like, oh, you can't have strong female characters who are also attractive. But yeah, I feel as if that's not really a Resident Evil 6 problem solely. I feel as if that's a kind of Capcom problem, and within the horror genre as a whole, that idea of having these types of characters and these inappropriate situations, like, yeah, I totally agree with that. I completely rolled my eyes when you had that scene where they escape from the facility of Neo Umbrella, which I thought was a cool idea. I thought Neo Umbrella sounded like a totally cooler name than Tricell in the 5th game. But yeah, you've got Jake shirtless, and then you've got Sherry in the most inappropriate hospital gown. It's not even a hospital gown. It's like, you know why they've put her in that. It's so, oh, look, they are getting closer. And I mean, it is kind of sweet that Jake looks away and everything, and he's quite polite to her. And again, it's like, there are elements where you're just like, yeah, great. The whole Ada bursting from the cocoon thing, I was like, oh, this is odd. Thanks, Capcom, for this. It's more of a Capcom issue. And one thing I thought was quite funny, and I don't know if you remember this, but one thing I did laugh at quite a bit was, I am so used to see the remakes now of Leon's character in 2 and 4, and they've taken out some of his more inappropriate comments away towards women. So, you know, in 4 where Ada shoots off and she goes away and he's left sitting in the boat and he rolls his eyes and he goes, oh, woman, and things like that. You're like, oh dear, that doesn't hold up today. But then they've changed it to him saying something like, oh, story of my life and everything. It's so weird seeing the old characterization of Leon where he's trying to flirt with people and he's like, oh my gosh. It's one of the few things I'm not going to levy against the game because it is probably a product of the time and everything, and that's how Leon was represented. At the same time though, what did you think of the globe trotting in this game? Did you feel as if this was a good part of the game, or did you feel as if there wasn't much much to it.
If one thing I'd say is I think it gives it maybe a slightly distinctive feel to some of the other games in the mainline series, which I think it can be a good thing. Again, I think it has the same problem that I had with Resident Evil 5 in that I don't really find any location where I was like, oh, that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed being in that location. I remember the is it Edonia? The European-esque country. I remember bits of that. I remember bits of stuff in China and stuff. And I suppose there's some of the bits, isn't there, with Leon and Helena in somewhere in America. So I can kind of vaguely remember these sort of settings. But again, there's nothing that I think is that memorable, unfortunately. And again, it's not maybe trying to evoke the same type experience as things like 4 and some of the older games were. But again, just when you think of some of the Resident Evil, when I think of some of the Resident Evil games, I'm always drawn to things like the Spencer Mansion, the Raccoon City Police Department, the castle in Resident Evil 4. There's just nothing like that to me in 5, and especially in 6 as well. As much as I think the Globetrotting is an interesting idea, and again, it fits in with the bigger scale, and I suppose it does give a bit of a unique element to 6, I just don't think there was anything that was that stand out to me that made me think, oh, I really enjoyed visiting this part of the game. You know, it was just all sort of blurs in a bit to the slog that I found the game, to be honest.
I've still got trauma, see, from Ada's first mission, and you're on that damn ship trying to get out, and the amount of times I think I ended up drowning because I just couldn't find my way out, and I'm like, oh god, I hate that so much. That was probably the only memorable bit for me, but no, I'm totally with you there. Each game, and it is weird to say, but each game definitely has, as you said, that one iconic location, like with Spencer's Mansion, with the Raccoon City Police Department, with the castle. I was thinking about this when you were talking about the bombasticness, as it were, of this game, that for all the over-the-top action in the 5th game, I feel as if we really emphasise that for the 5th game, that it's just Chris punching boulders and he's punching zombies and things like that and the infected. I forgot how slow the 5th game can be in terms of building up an atmosphere, especially at the beginning. It doesn't just drop you into the action, it drops you into this West African village, and you're walking through, you've got all of the inhabitants looking at you very distrusting, you meet Sheva, you meet your informant and things, and then that slowly builds up to the infection, and then you're isolated and stuck in this infected village and you have to fight your way out. The build up for that was very slow. They built up the atmosphere, it was very methodical, and again, some bits work, some bits definitely didn't, but at least I felt as if they had an idea that they were still remembering, this is a horror game, but for all the action games that were coming out at the time, they just said, we need an explosion at the very beginning, we need Leon to pew pew everything, we need this, we need that. It felt as if you couldn't breathe in this game. There's no part of this game where I think you were able just to relax and go through it at your own pace. Maybe at the beginning of Leon's story, where you're going through the university campus. I thought that was quite interesting. You're like, this is quite slow and it's building up stuff, but then you've got the gribbly monsters, and then you've got actual zombies that come out the ground in the cemetery. Then you've got, is it right in saying the booby gas monster? Because I cannot remember the name of it.
A lot of this is to be very Left 4 Dead inspired, but yeah, that's probably an apt description, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a very inappropriate, just slap a sensor bar over it. Because, it is not a fun time. And again, you've got that whole thing of the city that Leon's in, and he's supposed to be protecting the president, and to cover up, they nuke the city and everything. Remember how big of a deal that was in Resident Evil 2 and 3, where you had to rush against the clock and try and get out of there before the whole city was going to get destroyed? Whereas in this one, it's kind of an afterthought, because you see it, you go, oh no, how terrible. And then you have to move on to the next set piece where Hunnigan, Leon's assistant, helps, or rather one of the government agents helps him out by putting him on a plane to China. We've got a massive outbreak of the C virus there, which I have to admit, that was one of my favourite scenes of this. See where it's like the kind of pre-rendered scene, and I think it was one they used a lot for the promotion, where it's Chris yelling down the phone at Leon and Helena yelling, get out of there, there's a bomb that's about to go off, it blows up, the blue smoke just rolls through the city, and then you've got all the zombies that just pop out. It's so well done. But the thing is, you don't really, no pun intended, you don't have time to breathe for these moments. It's like, oh no, this whole city in China has been infected. How awful. Anyway, let's move on to the next set piece, And even with Ada realising that this guy, Simmons, had cloned her essentially and tricked a woman into, I think it was the woman who he turns, her name's Carla, and she was his head of research or genetic engineering, that kind of thing. And then he tricks her into taking the virus, if you read the lore and everything. And she turns into Ada and decides to create Neo Umbrella on the back of that and make Ada Wong look bad for some reason, even though nobody would know who Ada Wong is, except for obviously the core cast, because you've got people going, oh my god, it's Ada Wong. And then you're like, why would anybody know who Ada Wong was? It's like, no one would know. That's a bit of a nitpick for the plot, but we could spend hours talking about how much the plot doesn't make sense. But we kind of joked about it in the opening skit, but they don't give you enough time to ruminate on anything, do they?
Not at all. It does feel like it's trying to shuffle you from one kind of set piece to another. It's interesting one. This is something that I did see in a fair few criticisms of the game. They do have these slow sections, but they really don't fill the purpose of what slow sections should do and what they have done in previous games. Where, like, if we take Resident Evil 4 again, for an example, so obviously, once you've done the initial bit, you get into the very famous village square fight, which is a very high-octane, high-tension battle against the Ganados and everything. And then after that, though, it dies down, and then you have a very quieter, kind of a little bit spooky trip through the farm section and everything, and that kind of slows the pace and I guess brings a bit more of that spooky tension to it and everything. And other games have done that, in the series have done that quite well as well, where it seems that in Resident Evil 6 you do get these slow bits, but they don't really build anything. They just sort of feel like they're there to artificially slow things down and drag it out a bit, and really don't seem to add much to the experience. In fact, you probably do just kind of forget about them too much because you just think about the set piece kind of stuff. It feels like a kind of weird inclusion that doesn't really fit with the game because it's not really a tense experience, to be honest, or like a very particularly horror-filled one. So it's like, what are these sections doing? It's not even like really downtime, really, to be honest. It drags out a bit too long. So it's just unevenly paced, to be honest, which is a shame. Like, it feels like they weren't able to bring it together into the kind of cohesive experience I guess they were hoping.
And that does summarise it perfectly, to be honest, because I feel as well, and I don't know how you felt about it when you first played it, but I felt like a lot of the enemies in this game didn't necessarily feel like Resident Evil enemies. You've got your zombies and everything. Oh, look, oh no, your mutations of creatures. And then you've got the bugs, and you're like, okay, this is a bit... technically, it has happened before, especially with 5, the game before it. But then, as I said, you've got the T-Rex, which makes no sense. The Javo, who are the... It's as if they've taken them out of another FPS game, because the Javo are just zombies with guns, because you come across certain zombies that do have guns, but they've got no sense of how to use it. They just fire it off randomly and in random directions, because they've obviously had these weapons before their turn, so you can kind of understand that. But the Javo are just souped up, almost super soldiers that you have to fight against. And as I said, when you're pummeling through half of them, you're like, this isn't tense. It doesn't feel, I don't know, it doesn't feel tense, or you're on the edge of your seat going, oh, what's going to happen next? Because honestly, you hit the nail on the head there, that when you get your downtime moments and your slow moments, it doesn't really add anything, because the idea of a slow moment, especially in a horror game, is it's supposed to build up that tension of, oh, what's coming next? What is going to be popping around that corner? Are you going to be able to face it or not? Or are you going to have to run away from it? You've got that especially in the second remake of Resident Evil 2, where you hear the footsteps, you absolutely what yourself, because you know what's coming next. You don't know, and you just have to make sure that you're prepared as normal. But there's so many moments like that where, especially the aftermath of the bomb that goes off in China, and you've got the smoke coming through and everything, and you're rolling your eyes going, can this car speed up any faster? And it's like, nope, we're gonna go plenty 20. Let's just go up this hill. You're like, oh my god, this is excruciating. This is just one of the worst experiences of a horror game I've ever played. And again, I wouldn't even count this as a horror game. It's got horror elements in it. As I said, I can understand why they went in this direction, but I feel as if, as a kind of summary of my thoughts about this game, it's way too bloated, it's too convoluted. The themes that they tried to attempt, some of them really work, and I really like the way they've added to the lore of it, but other things like the sea virus, did not like that at all. I thought that was just silly. The whole Ada plotline, it was just convoluted and over the top. Leon and Chris's story was probably the closest I got to enjoying the game, and bits of Jake's as well, but I don't know. It feels like one step forward and 100 back, but flipping it on to you, what are your final thoughts of this game?
The too bloated comment, I think, is the one that I would totally agree with. And I think the trouble is that if you don't gel with this game and you don't get into it, there's too much of it, and it's not a fun thing to play at any point, which is a real shame. So definitely too bloated. I think it's a game that I look at that I'm sad that the ambition they had for it just didn't come together. I think there is things to admire in some of the plots, some of the storylines, some of the story elements, and I think the idea of having these sort of 4 distinct campaigns, I actually think is a very good idea, and I think Capcom should be praised for the ambition of trying to accomplish it. Unfortunately, it proved to be too much for them to do. I think it really is a shame, and I do look at it with a lot of regret, this one, because I do think there is stuff in here that could have made this a really standout game in the series. Now, again, whether you like the direction it went or not is sort of immaterial in my opinion to it. I think if they'd been able to pull off what they wanted to do, it could have been a really standout entry. It could have made it quite distinct from the other sort of games in the series. But alas, wasn't to be, and we are sort of left with, in my opinion, as you say, something that's too bloated, and I just don't think it's got the fun factor. It's not got the fun factor or the kind of scare factor of the other games, and in that way it's just something that's quite forgettable, sadly, and honestly something that I don't really have any desire to go back and play, which I think is a real shame.
I actually went back to play bits and pieces of it before we hopped on tonight, and honestly I just didn't enjoy myself. I think that the action gameplay and everything is relatively well done though, and kind of ending on a positive note as it were. I think the action gameplay is a lot tighter in this game as opposed to the 4th and 5th game where you had that stand and deliver gameplay loop where you had to get fixed in one position and be like, stand and deliver, and then shoot them and hope that they didn't get to you first. But that is one of the few things I think definitely worked in it, but I feel as if they kind of went too far in creating more of a, not a first person, but the over-the-shoulder third-person shooter like we've had before with other games, especially with stuff like Gears of War and whatnot, which I feel as if Gears of War, ironically enough, did that better than this game, but again, that's a whole month for another day, of course. This kind of game, when I think about the people who like this game, the people that I do think of are the ones who probably played this at the time as a co-op game. You know, don't get me wrong, there will be hardcore fans out there that will absolutely adore this game. They will defend it to the death because they're like, anything Resident Evil was amazing. But I can see why people would have fun with this game because it's over the top, it's goofy, it's very action heavy and whatnot, but I can see why people would love it. A bit like why I enjoyed Resident Evil 5 more when I was playing it with you than when I was playing it by myself, because it definitely leans into that, and unfortunately there's a lot of elements like that feel quite awkward because it almost feels like you're playing a different game, because half of it is you're fighting for your life in a pit with this massive monster, and then on the other side you've got, I don't know, somebody else pulling a lever and be like, it's okay guys. So it's like completely different, and you miss the action in some parts, especially at the very end of the Leon campaign where I think Helena is trapped in an office block and all you can do is look down at Leon and Ada fighting for their lives. What I will say, and this might be slightly controversial to the shippers out there, but I did like the dynamic between Ada and Leon. I thought it was quite a sweet dynamic that he was still very protective of her, and there's arguments that they only knew each other for a few days and whatnot, but I don't know, I thought that was nice the way they did that. Again, the main thing about this is the ambition. I've said this before half jokingly that I am of course a Sonic fan. I have seen what ambition does to a game when the developers aren't ready, especially something like Sonic 06 where it's a massive game, they have massive ideas, and then they're like, nah, we can't pull this off, and it's such a shame. And I think to a degree Capcom have pulled off this game, but I don't think they've fully realised it, if that makes sense.
100%. It's something that I think, I can imagine the development team probably being sad that perhaps they didn't get to realise realised what they had hoped. And I think the scale just ran away from them. And I think video games are, and have been for a while, a very expensive and time-consuming thing to make. You've only got a limited amount of time, and so I think just over-ambition can be, and has been, a killer for games like all the way probably back to their early days. We've seen that plenty of times. Think of things like Daikatana and stuff like that. Over-ambition can be a total killer, and I think it claimed another victim here in Resident Evil 6. And I think, unfortunately, what also hasn't helped Resident Evil 6's sort of legacy is that the Capcom's telling of their own history, it seems like, in recent years, where the years after Resident Evil 6 are seen as the real low point and the real time of woe for Capcom, where everything was wrong and revenue was down and really, the studio was not in a good place. And then come the end of 2016, especially through 2017, they sort of righted the ship with things like Monster Hunter, and then obviously Resident Evil 7 is a big part of that story, of their rebirth to where they are now. And they're, again, a very well-respected and very well-liked company in the video game space. So I think the fact that they kind of, in their own telling, Resident Evil 6 is one of these things that started to sink them to their kind of rock bottom, doesn't help it. So in a way, it maybe seems that Resident Evil 6 is, Capcom don't look at it as a very fond memory, or maybe don't look at it very wistfully at all. Instead, they look at the way they brought it back from the brink. So yeah, it's a shame. I think it's a real shame what happened to this. And I can understand. I know people really do like this game, and that's great. It's always great when people do enjoy a game, and I think it does seem like if you really can sort of get to grips with the combat and meet it on its own terms, you can have a lot of fun playing it. I still don't think it probably removes the rough edges of this game, and not everybody's going to have that experience just because of the way the game is. It's just not going to be for everybody. So I think it's a shame. I think it's a real shame what happened to it. And it's a shame in a way we weren't able to get that big sort of globe-trotting mega blockbuster entry into the series, which I think would have made a really nice, unique entry, whether you completely liked the direction or not. I'm not saying it's not fun, because the game is functional, so I'm not trying to say it's not a functional game, but the reality had matched the vision that Capcom wanted. I think it could have been a really, really interesting entry into the franchise. But again, that's not the world we live in, sadly.
And that is the sad thing as well, that we've got this game that clearly they put in a lot of loose threads in this game. Like, for example, at the end of Ada's story, which I find this weird that this is the post-credit scene for Ada's story, but you've got Jake Wesker, who is, I know that technically it's Jake Miller, but Jake Wesker, who is in this random village that's been overrun by BOW creatures, and he was become this almost saviour figure going from place to place. And I thought that was an interesting idea. I was like, oh, cool, I wonder how they're going to carry that on from here. And it's a bit like, that scene from Toy Story 2 where Woody's like, oh yeah, put on the next episode. The Frost Rector's like, there was the last episode, Woody. And you're like, oh my god. So it's a shame, because I feel as if bar the loose reference here or there, because I think it was one of the Resident Evil films recently, the animated ones, where Chris is talking to Jill, and there's quite a poignant conversation that they both have. And he talks about not taking risks and how he lost one of his colleagues, Pierce, because he took the virus. And Jill talks about the trauma of being overtaken by Wesker was really damaging to her mental health, as it were, to put it, very loosely. But the fact is that this game is definitely a product of its time, and it's one of those cult games, I think, that while people do enjoy it, and while people say, oh, this is an amazing game, it's, a lot of fun, it's so goofy, it's so over the top, a bit like how you and I watch really bad movies, but at the same time, man, it is, as you said, it's a rough playing experience, especially if you're playing it on your own. And that's not a slight at anyone who's playing it on their own, but if you're playing it on your own and you think, oh, I can't wait to play this game, play the other ones. Even 5 I would recommend. And again, I wasn't the biggest fan of 5, but I think that both of these games, for all their flaws, do have redeeming qualities. So if you are curious, then absolutely feel free to check it out. I'm not going to promise that you're going to enjoy it, but if you do enjoy it, even better. And again, I just want to highlight something that you said there, Adam, that if you enjoy this game, don't let anybody who says, oh, Resident Evil 6 is a terrible game and you should feel bad, or oh, Resident Evil 5 sucked, that kind of thing. If you like these games or you had very memorable experiences with them, don't let anybody say, oh, that's terrible, you should feel bad, And I always say that, we both say that, but it's definitely a game that if you enjoyed it, if you loved it, absolutely bully, feel free, go ahead. But in some summary. These are controversial entries into the series for a reason, and unfortunately they do feel like staples of the time that fortunately and unfortunately caused Capcom to reboot the entire series, which of course led to Resident Evil 7 and 8, which of course we will indeed be talking about next week. And I honestly can't wait for it because I did not get spooked for a full couple of hours just not to talk about it. So on that note, Adam, thank you so much for putting up with me and my terrible shooting in Resident Evil 5, and discussing these controversial but time capsule games, as it were, of the Resident Evil franchise.
It's my pleasure, and you know what? It was a lot of fun to revisit Resident Evil 5, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's the greatest game in the franchise, but it's one that I still hold a lot of fondness for. You know, I said it was my first game in this franchise. I feel like it really got me into playing the rest of them, so I will always hold it fondly. I always think it's a really good co-op experience. I, again, don't have that same fondness for 6, sadly, but I still think, you know what, there's stuff in that game to admire, and I think it's just a really interesting period for this franchise, to be honest. It's interesting what was going on at the time. I think it's interesting where the series was going, the reaction to it, and I think it's the legacy of these two games. I think particularly 6 is fascinating. And, you know, for whatever it's worth, I think we can't take away that they sold well, these games, at the end of the day. So I don't think Capcom were mad to go down this direction with the franchise. It obviously didn't pay off in the long run, but, you know, I think it makes for a really interesting period. So I was more than happy to come on and talk about them. So thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure having you back on. And again, I apologise I had to be about Resident Evil 5 and 6. I swear to goodness, next time you're back, we will get a cheerier subject. We'll get one that's definitely a lot more. Is enjoyable the right word?
Enjoyable in a different way.
Yes, very true. Not in a deadly premonition way, more in an objectively good way, yeah. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. And of course, if you want to listen to more of our episodes of Resident Evil Month, as well as other episodes from ourselves, then you can check us out at our website, Satsunami.com, as well as all good podcast apps. I also want to thank our amazing Pandalorian patrons, Robotic Battle Toaster, Ghostie, and Cryptic1991. Thank you so much for supporting the show. But if you would like access to exclusive episodes, behind the scenes content, bloopers, more baking related puns from Adam and I, then of course you can check us out at our Patreon page, patreon.com/Chatsunami. This podcast is of course a proud member of the PodPack Collective. For more information, check out our Twitter/X page at PodPack Collect. But until next time, thank you all so much for joining. And of course next week I will be joined by the one and only Dan from Casting Views to talk about Resident Evil Biohazard and Village. As always, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, stay hydrated.